Let the word go
The
forth.
challenge, the opportunity to connect. The 1960s, a time of imagination and change, a time of anger and fear. The 1960s, a pioneering program called Challenge
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
that looked at our connections, our divisions, through the lens of shared values.
For something real.
60 years later, we examine our divisions, our connections, our shared pains and successes in a new program called Challenge 2.0. The Seattle-based Northwest Coalition for Responsible Investment was founded 31 years ago with the recognition that every purchase is a vote, one that reflects personal values and ethics. Those purchases include investments in corporate stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. The efforts of faith-based organizations to influence corporate policies and practices have recently encountered increasingly stiff opposition, including intimidation tactics. We discuss the importance, successes, and frustrations of investor activism with Sister Susan Francoise. Her order is one of the 14 members of the coalition. Well, we're very fortunate to have with us in studio Sister Susan Francoise, and you have, if I can just tell a couple of things, you're the assistant congregation leader of the Sisters of St. Joseph of Peace, and you have regional offices in Bellevue, New Jersey, and in England.
Yes.
You are a member of the Seattle-based Northwest Coalition for Responsible Investment, we're going to be talking about in great detail, and you're an author, columnist, and blogger. And your blog is entitled
At the Corner of Susan and St. Joseph.
And I've read a couple of those, and we're going to put that up on the screen.
Okay.
Very interesting thoughts. I enjoyed those very much.
Thank you.
As we get into this conversation, Susan, and the concept of investor activism, responsible investment, I'd just like to know, do you have a personal background that really interested you in this area, that you would take that on as a mission?
Well, it is a mission that my congregation has had, but personally, it is a fit. As the daughter of Frank and Eileen Francoise, I was raised to use our gifts and our talents to make the world a better place, and to also use our influence that we have. So I grew up in a suburb that was mostly white outside of Washington, D.C., and my mother used to take us shopping. We didn't have a shopping center in our town. So you either went one direction to a wealthy white suburb, or you went the other direction to a middle-class black suburb. And my mother always made us shop in the black suburb because we should use our dollars to help their economy. And so I think when I first worked with Sister Judy Byron at the Northwest Coalition of Responsible Investment at IPJC, to be with sisters who kind of live that same ethos and use our resources to bring about the common good, just seems like a natural fit.
Well, and speaking of natural fits, tell us a little bit about how you came to be involved with the Northwest Coalition for Responsible Investment. Sister Judy Byron has been on this program too many years ago, but how did you get involved in that?
Sure. So our congregation is a member both of the Northwest Coalition and then also a sister organization in New Jersey called Investor Advocates for Social Justice. And we have been part of those from the very beginning because they are a collaborative effort of Catholic sisters. And so the Catholic sisters here in the Northwest have brought their resources together to be a voice of influence for justice using our investments. And the congregation has been part of that, so as I've been congregation treasurer, that has been my direct role. But when I worked at IPJC during my formation as a justice advocate, I shared a wall with Sister Judy. Our offices were next to each other. And so I would hear her or see her at coffee after she got off a dialogue call with executives from Walmart or from Dick's Sporting Goods or these major places. And it just gave me as a young sister some insight into the moral authority that we have and the way that we can make a difference just by being at the corporate table.
I want to explore really two different directions. One is your congregation of Sisters of St. Joseph of Peace, and their involvement with this. But also, very often, and I've heard this, when you bring up an issue like responsible investment, when you talk about social activism, social injustice, very often people will respond by, well, what does that have to do with faith? What do you say to them when you hear a question like that?
It has everything to do with faith. I mean, just go back to those of us who are familiar with the Christian scriptures. What did Jesus do in the temple with the moneylenders? So I would say and in the Jewish scriptures, if you look at the calls of the prophets, the call to Jubilee, debt forgiveness, all of those things, we are human beings, and our economic reality, you can't separate that from our faith reality. And then, of course, in the Catholic tradition, as a Catholic sister, we have a tradition back to the 1890s of Catholic social teaching that began really as a response to the Industrial Revolution and the impact on poor and marginalized peoples, and also the responsibility to contribute to a good economy that is good for people. And our congregation, in terms of our history, we began with actual shareholder advocacy in the 1970s on issues of gender and sexism. But prior to that, we've always used our economic resources, whether it's our founder who brought railroad shares with her to the congregation, which was our initial wealth that we had, and then she would use that to feed the poor. So there's always been an effort to use our economic interests for the interest of the gospel.
As you mentioned your congregation and its initial roots, maybe tell us just a little bit about its origin.
Our founder was actually Anglo-Irish, and she had been a Poor Clare sister in Ireland for 25 years during the years of the famine. And she was a writer, and she started out writing holy books, and she started really looking at the impact of landlord rules and things that were really impacting the poor and the impact on the famine and the real poor people. And so not only did she use the profits of her books to fund a famine relief fund, so she provided direct relief to the poor, but she also started writing critical essays about how the landed gentry were part of the system that was causing that inequity, and even how the Catholic clergy was part of that system that was leading to that inequity. Long story short, she founded us in Nottingham, England in 1884 with the help of a bishop who had those same concerns, especially of the Industrial Revolution and the impact on the poor people and the cause of forced migration. And so our history is really tied to the reality of how economics, if it's not done through a lens of common good, can cause harm to impacted peoples and actually cause poverty. And our mission was really to help immigrant Irish women coming both to England and then also to the United States. And within 6 years of our founding in 1890, we were out here in Bellingham, Washington, meeting the needs of the new Washington Territory. So we have always been grounded with the people.
Long history here then.
Yes, very long.
It seems like it was a natural fit then for your order to go ahead and get connected with Northwest Coalition for Responsible Investment. Fill in for people that are not familiar with that, a little bit about what their strategy is, how they operate.
Sure. So Northwest CRI and the other coalitions around the country it's really an interfaith movement. So Northwest CRI is founded by the Catholic Sisters of the Northwest. I believe the Jesuits are also part of it, so a few good men are there with us. But in the Interfaith Center for Corporate Responsibility, you have Jewish groups, Christian groups of all stripes. Quakers are there. You have every faith is welcome at the table of the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, because we all have in our faith traditions those common foundations of care for the poor, care for earth, really the golden rule is it crosses all of those lines. And so what we do is each of our organizations, while we are not as faith-based investors, we're not there to make a profit, but we are there to have enough funds to support our mission. So for the Catholic Sisters, that's why we have investments, so that we can take care of our sisters and support our mission. But as faith-based investors, we realized, starting really with the anti-apartheid movement, that we have rights as shareholders. We own stocks, and we have rights as shareholders to be at that corporate table and to share what is both our faith-based motivation, but also better for business. And so what these groups do is they look at their portfolio, and if there is a corporate policy or practice that we really feel could be better for business and for the common good, then we see which group has that, and if they're willing to be the lead filer, and then we write a letter to the company state our business case, and in our case, state our faith-based case as well,
Right.
because it's always a
Right.
faith-based business case. And our goal is to be in dialogue with them. Many times that works, and we can be in dialogue and help them to move in that direction. Sometimes the dialogue breaks down, and that's when we file what's called a corporate resolution that goes to the annual meeting of the shareholders. Those are not binding requirements, but what they do is they allow the shareholders to say, we agree, this is an issue. So for example, a few years ago, we were the lead filer with Microsoft on the use of facial recognition technology and racial profiling by law enforcement and totalitarian governments. And what we wanted was Microsoft just to, that's their policy that they don't do that. And yet we had learned through our partners that they were advocating for legislative changes that would allow them to do that. And so in our dialogues with them, which were over a few years, we asked them if they would just issue a report that outlines that they're not doing that or what they are doing in their lobbying. And initially the dialogues didn't work really well, and so we did take it to a vote of the shareholders. I forget the number, but something like 50 or 60% of shareholders agreed with us. Not faith-based ones, just your average shareholders, but we're the ones who made the argument. And then the next year, Microsoft came back to the table, and we, in dialogue, came to an agreement, and so we were able to withdraw that. So it's really just a collaborative effort of values-based investors who want to be in dialogue and help the companies to do better business.
As I listen to you talk about this, very often you'll hear calls for divestment from those corporations. Perhaps there's a place for that, but it sounds like you also see that there's a reason to stay at the table with them and be a part of that influence.
We really have a three-legged stool
Okay.
on how we use our investments for good. And what's interesting is we've had this approach for a long time, but about 3 years ago, the Vatican issued a document, which in English means good measure. But they talk about how as investors, as faith-based investors, we have three calls. The call to engage, which is what we just talked about. So sometimes it is good to have stock in a company that you may not always agree with their business outcome so that you can be at the table. So that's one thing to do. The other is a call to enhance, which is investing intentionally in things that make a difference in the world. So perhaps good climate action for affordable housing that has solar panels, something like that. And then, so engage, enhance, and exclude.
Okay.
So we do exclude. We are, as a congregation, we've fully divested from fossil fuels about 3 or 4 years ago. And over 30 years ago, we fully divested from weapons. But we actually have decided to buy some weapons manufacturers so that we can engage. So it's you have to be prudent and be willing to have a purpose for whatever your investment strategy is, whether it's to engage, to enhance, or to exclude.
But it calls for more than just what might be characterized as a knee-jerk response. No, I don't want anything to do with that. You're taking a look at it and saying, perhaps we can have some agency with this.
Yes, and as example on the nuclear weapons question, we had to go back to the sisters because it was the sisters, even before I was a sister. I think
Right.
I was in elementary school when they made that decision. And so we had to go back to them and say, this is why we think we probably want to buy just enough shares so that we can, because legally there's a certain amount of shares that you have
Right.
to own and how
One
long
share
you
is
have
not
to
going
own
to
it.
do it.
No. And they agreed with the argument. And so, and we'll see how it goes. If those dialogues are completely unfruitful, maybe it's not worth it. But the world is not black and white.
No, it's not. Well, we're seeing, when you were talking about to exclude, or perhaps because of corporate misbehavior, we're seeing headwinds develop stronger than from what I can think of. We're seeing SLAPP lawsuits. In fact, as we're sitting here, there was just a major SLAPP lawsuit, at least at this stage, decided against Greenpeace. Exxon filed legal action against shareholders who just wanted to raise a resolution, and the SEC is getting much more engaged in trying to block these things. Some accuse them of muzzling shareholders. How do you see this?
Well, shareholders do have a right because they are shareholders. And so I think ultimately the arc of justice is long, and ultimately shareholders will not put up with too much of muzzling. Just to be clear, shareholder resolutions are filed by people with all sorts of ideological stripes. So you may have the Catholic Sisters advocating in line with Catholic social teaching on human rights and others. If you follow what's happened with Costco, Costco has had a lot of attention in the news because a certain group of shareholders that did not want diversity efforts filed a resolution, and the company's shareholders and the board said they want to stay with it.
Right.
So it can happen on any way. So I think we always have to be careful if we have a knee-jerk reaction based on our disagreement with the issue in our society. We try to have fair rules for everyone. That being said, right now there is a lot of pushback against what's called environmental, social, and governance investment. ESG are the initials that are used, and they are not understood really to what they are because they can be on any level there. But there is pushback from companies and also at the government level. There have been attempts to have legislation in Congress. I think it did pass the House but didn't go to the Senate that would allow the companies to decide if the shareholders get to vote on an issue.
What would you say if one of these business leaders said, well, that has nothing to do with our work as a business? What would be your response to that?
Well, so for example, on the climate financing and indigenous rights, it is bad business. More than 25% of shareholders the last 3 years have agreed with us that it is bad business for a bank to not pay attention to internationally recognized requirements that if you're going to go across indigenous people's lands, that they have prior and informed consent. If shoppers know, if consumers know, if people know that their dollars are being used to ignore human rights, look what's been happening with Target, look what's been happening with Costco. It's bad business. So I think reputational harm is a real business risk. And by having shareholders have this vehicle, because we're out there, we're with the impacted communities, we're with the people, and so we can be a barometer to help them be better business people.
Where they may be separated off from that. As part of this overall story, is there a deeper element in terms of our valuation of money and power? And I'm thinking in terms of reading about the compensation and power accorded CEOs, just doing some of the research. Economist magazine came out with an article questioning whether CEOs are the new monarchs. And I think there was a citation that since 1978, CEO compensation had gone up an average of 1,100%, while the average worker, their compensation over that same period had gone up less than 100%. How does that strike you? Is this ultimately a question of changing values and what we're willing to accept?
Well, so we are in a change of era. Pope Francis has named this as a change of era on many, many levels. And I think if we just look at our current geopolitical reality right now, those who are the billionaire class, what some are calling oligarchs, in many ways, there's echoes back, if we know our history, to the Gilded Age. And we have the 40-hour work week because of the reaction to what happened during the Gilded Age, where a very small group of men took a lot of the power and had those. We have workplace safety. I just recently listened to an audiobook about Frances Perkins, who was the labor secretary under Franklin Roosevelt.
Yes.
And before she became the labor secretary and instituted Social Security, she witnessed personally a tragedy in New York City called the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire, where immigrant women, this is the turn of the century, were working in downtown New York in a clothing factory that caught fire, and they were locked in and plunged to their deaths. And that led her to really advocate for workplace safety. I'm bringing these up because that was another time in history where there were those big inequity gaps when the dollar was more important than human life. And some would argue that we perhaps are in a similar time right now. And so I think those of us that are consumers, drawing back on my faith again, Pope Benedict said, in one of his documents that purchasing is always a moral and never just a consumer act. So how we spend our dollars, how we hold companies accountable, is part of our faith.
You were talking about some of these workplace safety issues, and I think in the area of what the coalition is working on, what your order is working on, we hear a lot in terms of employee rights versus management rights. Are there any issues either with that dovetailing with immigrants that are arising right now?
There really are. We've been in dialogues with Tyson Foods and other meat packing plants because there are definite workplace safety issues there with a largely immigrant population. There are, believe it or not, child workers are coming back into our sphere, not only in countries like in chocolate and in mining for all those wonderful minerals that make your cell phone work or your electric car. There are children involved in the mining of those materials and minerals as well. But in this country, there are more and more unauthorized child workers that are being used by companies. And if you don't have advocates knowing that and helping to tell their stories, we one day will wake up and not recognize the economy that we have.
This has been a very difficult year for many people.
It's only 3 months in.
We're only 3 months in, not even a full 3 months in. As we tape this, we should mention. But a lot of people are feeling disenfranchised, unable to impact the way their lives are going for them, but also the world around them. In the face of that sense of depression, disengagement, what would you offer in terms of your advice to them on what they can do, where they can get some agency in all of this?
Agency, very important word. I forget where I heard this recently, but I've seen it several places attributed to many people, that action is the antidote to anxiety. And I've been thinking and praying about this a lot because our congregation, when we were founded, our bishop at that first Mass, when the sisters professed their vows, said that our purpose was to help people find peace in the sin, strife, restless anxiety, and turmoil of the modern world, which is where we're at right now. And so I really have been thinking about this and praying about this. And one insight that I have comes from I have a master's degree in theological ethics, and I studied about 12 years ago or so. And one thing I looked at was in another time in history, in Nazi Germany, how ordinary Christians, not the superhero folks that you hear about, like those who hid Anne Frank, for example, but ordinary Christians, how they responded. And there's a political psychologist named Kristen Renwick Monroe who has studied their oral histories. And I think she came across something that is indicative of what we can do. What she found is those that were supporting of the regime felt that they were victims. And so when they did act, it was to protect themselves and be against others. The largest group were the bystanders, and they did not think they had agency. They felt that they were just one person against the regime. And so they closed their eyes and they let it happen. And I think people, as you describe, who are anxious, don't want to do that. They want to do something. The third group, there were three things they had in common. They saw that they had agency. They saw that they were connected to all people, and human life was part of their worldview. So as I look at this time and all of these forces that are hitting us with social media and with our globally connected world, it's super overwhelming. I think whatever someone can choose to do every day to use the agency they have, so choosing where you spend your money is one example, that can support human life as a value. So if there are people in your community that are being harmed, can you stand up with them in solidarity? Can you call Congress? Can you disagree with a family member who says something about a group that you think is not appropriate? And how again, what actions you can do to really help us realize that we're connected. Because part of what happens is we don't tell stories. People don't know that they have family members, that they have relatives, that they have neighbors that are impacted by these laws. Medicaid is at risk. I saw a news story of someone saying that she wasn't worried about it because she didn't have Medicaid, and she named her state's Medicaid program, which has a different name, that she's on. We don't know.
Right.
So if there are ways that we can not argue, not fight, but tell stories, I think that will help.
Any particular places you'd recommend if people want to inform themselves more, that they can get information and have a sense for at least a foundation for their action?
So the Northwest Cry website is one really good resource.
Okay.
They have links to what are called proxy voter guides.
Okay.
Many of your viewers may have stocks. And as a stock owner, you often get an opportunity to vote on those proxies.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you go onto the Northwest Cry website, which will also take you to the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility website,
Mm-hmm.
they will have resources and guides on there so that, let's say you own stock in City, you could support our resolution, which is coming up at their annual meeting.
Well, I know for a fact that sometimes, say if you have somebody managing your investments, you need to ask them, okay, we want to get the proxy notification sent to us, just not automatically voted.
Yes. Yes, so it is important to have a good relationship with your investment advisors. And even if you are not an individual owner of that stock, if you're in a mutual fund or something, you do have the right to ask them that you would like them to support that.
Sister, thank you so much for taking time out of your visit here, and continued best wishes for all the good work that you and your order does, and certainly the coalition as well. So thank you so much. We hope you'll visit us again sometime.
Thank you. This has been great.
And thank you all of you for joining us on this edition of Challenge 2.0. We hope you'll tune in again next week. Thank you.